Welcome back. This video is going to walk you through some ideas from a paper that I wrote and published in the journal Ethics in Medicine. It came out in 2011, volume 27, issue number 1. And it's a paper that deals with the relationship of metaphysics applied to human personhood as it applies to the issue of stem cell research. And this is an ongoing philosophical debate that spills over into political debates, especially regarding stem cell research, but also IVF, in vitro fertilization treatment in reproductive technologies. So in this paper, what I'm going to argue is that the Aristotelian notions of teleology give us good grounding for thinking about the reality of personhood from conception on. And even for early stage embryos that may never be implanted in a human body, in their mother's body or a surrogate's body, that the right to life, because of personhood, is grounded in our essential nature. So I'll just read, and you can follow along and let me know what you think in the comments. The title is Teleology, Embryonic Personhood, and Stem Cell Research. Part 1. The Necessity and Irreducibility of Teleology. From Aristotle to Darwin, philosophers and biologists have recognized that there is a principle of teleology inherent in biological entities. Aristotle, in his Parts of Animals, claims the following, quote, "The cause of concern in natural generations are, as we see, more than one. There is the cause for the sake of which, the cause whence the beginning of motion comes. Now we must decide which of these two causes comes first, and which second. Plainly, however, the cause which is the first, which we call that for the sake of which. From this is the account of the thing, and the account forms the starting point, alike in works of art and in works of nature." It's from Parts of Animals, 639b, 10. So following Aristotle on this point, Darwin held that biological teleology is quite evident in the natural world, and teleology is a part and parcel of Darwinian natural selection and transmutation of species. Asa Gray, a friend of Darwin's, wrote that, quote, "We recognize the great service rendered by Darwin to natural science by restoring teleology to it, so that instead of having morphology against teleology, we shall henceforth have morphology married to teleology." It's from, quoted by Etienne Gilson in his work From Aristotle to Darwin and Back. Get the exact title of that work. Yeah, it is Gilson, From Aristotle to Darwin and Back Again, published 1984. It's probably published prior to that, but reissued from Notre Dame Press in 84. Of this passage, Darwin replied, "What you say about teleology pleases me especially, and I do not think anyone else has ever noticed the point. I have always said that you were the man to hit the nail on the head." So Darwin himself is recognizing that teleology is central to biological organisms. Following Aristotle, I understand the notion of biological teleology to be a logically prior and ontologically contemporaneous principle of change which is contained within beings containing heterogeneous parts, such that this principle accounts for the order and development plan of an organism, quote, "with the result that species exist whose characteristics are constant, as if the future of these beings had been predetermined in the seed from which they were born." That's from Etienne Gilson's book, end quote. So all henceforth call this view finalism. There's a reason for that, which is in part an attempt to give a reason for the very existence of the organism of living things. So I want to contrast finalism with vitalism. So finalism is different than vitalism. Vitalism is roughly the idea that there's a biological or ghostly force that's physical force that literally operates on living cells, such that, quote, "the activities of living organisms cannot be explained solely by the interaction of their component atoms, molecules, by known chemical and physical forces." This is from a textbook in Molecular Embryology by Michael Berry. Came out in the early 2000s. It's a standard textbook. I think it's Taylor and Francis publisher, so it's not not any kind of suspect philosophical view. At any rate, so the term finalism is not vitalism. I'm using this term differently than the concept of vitalism as a ghostly force. In his introduction to molecular embryology, J. Michael Berry cites the early experimental embryologist Hans Streich, he lived from 1867 to 1941, as a vitalist, maintained that living things possess, quote, a vital force, unlike any force familiar to scientists, a purposeful directive force like that suggested by Aristotle. It's Berry, page 2. So, this almost sounds Star Wars-esque. Midichlorians, whatever those things are called in Star Wars. Vitalism sounds a lot like that. Well, I'm going to distinguish between finalism and vitalism. So the way to distinguish between finalism, what I'm calling finalism, following Aristotle, and vitalism, which is I don't think is Aristotle's view at all, mischaracterized Aristotelianly by Berry. But the way to distinguish between finalism and vitalism is to consider this last quotation from Berry together with a comment from Gilson, who recognizes that although Aristotle talks about life, zoe, in Greek, or vita in Latin, Gilson says that Aristotle never intends by this word a distinct principle, a force and energy to which science or philosophy ought to have recourse as to a cause in order to make reasonable what we call the facts of biology. It's from Gilson's book, page 108. So if finalism and vitalism can be distinguished, it is possible then that finalism can be understood not as a physical vital force that works mechanically alongside the interaction of biomolecules, but rather as a philosophical ontological explanatory principle that helps to explain the philosophical question about biological subject matter that have to do with what Aristotle calls simply the end, the telos, the in view of which, tou eneka, and the why, the dia t. So that's what Aristotle's after, not some biological ghostly force. Again, that's from Gilson, page 2. So teleology as an ontological reality is not reducible to physicalistic or mechanistic processes. Any mechanistic reduction simply pushes teleology to a lower level, molecular, atomic, subatomic, subatomic, etc. I don't know how far down you want to push things. Higgs bosons is that the plural of bosons? Bosoni? Anyway. Either way, pushing teleology down is not elimination. There is a logical limit to what any attempted mechanistic explanatory reduction of teleology can accomplish, since necessarily biological mechanisms require at least 3 things. 1, certain existing entities. Okay, so all biological mechanisms require antecedent existing entities, whether at the level of a whole organism or at a, quote, lower level, molecular, atomic, subatomic, subatomic, etc. And 2, an environment in which they exist. This is a necessary condition there. And 3, quote, specific potential behaviors of those entities. Specific potential behaviors of those entities. So these 3 things are required for biological entities. And you can look at Aristotle's Parts of Animals, 640a and following, and it's also discussed in Gilson on page 6 and following. So this is especially important if necessarily to be is to be an entity with determinate properties. What would it mean for something to be or exist without any properties at all? Okay, so there's this relational aspect as well. So if teleological reductionism fails, another way to reject teleology would be to attempt to explain our common sense observations of natural teleology by appealing to chance. This is one option. So you're saying there's a chance. Teleology is on this view, a chance appeal, would be to maintain that teleology is only apparently real, but is really nothing but the chance causal connections between complex physical processes. However, to appeal to chance is a, quote, refusal to give an explanation rather than an explanation. It's from Gilson, page 107. Additionally, appealing to chance does not seem to be particularly useful as a proposal in aiding scientific inquiry into biological processes. Okay, so chance just doesn't doesn't really do much to further our understanding of the natural world. It's always, it reminds me kind of skepticism. Sure, it's possible. Right? It's always possible. You can refer to chance in this way, but it just doesn't seem to do any sort of work. So what I propose is that if Aristotle is right that human beings who by nature desire to know, it's from Aristotle, Aristotle's work, 988-25, and know more than mere appeals to chance, then teleology and finalism are necessary, ineliminable components for biology and philosophy of biology. Okay, so now that's a brief introduction to what I'm calling the necessity and irreducibility of teleology as it applies to biological organisms. Okay, so now on to part 2 of the paper. Human teleology and human personhood. So now we're going to move from teleology in biological organisms to teleology and human persons. So if teleology can't be eliminated from our ontology, then how should we understand it? One way of understanding teleology in biology comes from Aristotle, who claims that teleology should be understood analogous to human actions. Right? There's an artifactual analogy here. Recent philosophers have called this Aristotelian analogy into question. For example, Ernst Nagel claims that the use of the notion of goal-directedness does not appropriately apply to organisms as it does to intentional human acts. He questions the way in which a, quote, inner state of an organism resembles a, quote, complex mental state involving an intention, a desire, and a belief. Right, so the idea is, well, you can talk about intentional states in the mind or mental states, but not in non-mental organisms or parts of organisms or biological systems or something. So the Aristotelian rejoinder to this type of objection is that the resemblance here can be accounted for by considering that the parent animal pre-exists with its determinate end having been realized, and that the generation of the offspring proceeds according to a definite ontological plan contained within the organism itself. The resemblance of natural teleology to intentional human acts is the antecedent nature of the end which humans have, quote, in mind, and biological organisms have in nature. I'd probably clarify and say in essence. Both are internal to the thing in question. They're internal to the thing in question. Now, of course, the internal, the nature of a mental state being internal to a mind, and the nature of an essential teleology being internal to an organism, are different ways of an intention being internal. And one, of course, is possibly present before consciousness, while the other is simply natural in nature. But either way, that just shows there's two types of intentionality that are present in one in a mental state and one in a biological whole. Okay, so given the internal law-like pattern which the reality of teleology brings to organisms, we can also understand teleology to be a normative notion. There are correct and incorrect realizations of the internal teleological blueprints possessed by organisms. Even contemporary embryological biologists like Berry, who rightly reject vitalist explanatory concepts, use teleological concepts in describing embryological development. For example, in Chapter 2 of Berry's text entitled How an Embryo Acquires the Correct Shape as its Cell Divides, let me emphasize that, the, quote, correct shape, Berry discusses how cell adhesions function as the principal agents of morphoregulation, the arranging of cells into the correct, emphasis added, body structure, end quote, Berry, page 37. The notion of correct here is fully normative. There is a way that the shape of cells should be, but this is simply to include a teleological ontology in our understanding of embryological cellular development. The underlying morphoregulation is not guided by a mysterious vital force. Berry does a thorough job of summarizing the biochemistry behind morphoregulation. It's interesting that it's understandable. And just have to think about that. The fact that something so complex is understandable by a human mind almost indicates that it kind of mind behind it. But anyway, this isn't the place to argue for that here. But the explanatory concept of teleology is not eliminated from the ontology of the biochemistry of embryology. It's presupposed by it. Okay. Since teleology is real and is part and parcel of biological development, there are implications for the concept of personhood as applied to early-stage embryos. If the concept of teleology makes reference to the final end of the things in question, as that towards which the teleological process is moving, then the question becomes a logical one. Which is logically prior? Is it the complete end or the instrumental end, which allows the complete end to come about? If it's the instrumental end, then when studying embryological development, one cannot adjudicate between successful or unsuccessful developmental stages. For example, the initial cleavage divisions creating blastomeres can be identified not only as having occurred, but as having occurred successfully. But no such identification could be made if it were not antecedently known what exactly a successful cleavage division was. In cases of cryopreservation, for example, of early-stage embryos, during the first 5 days after conception, the only way that one can tell whether the freezing process was successful is to look at typical cases of normal gestational processes, which have successfully reached the goal of normally developed 5-day-old or younger embryos. The general logical point here is that knowledge of biological processes and their achievement or successful completion is always had with reference to the end result in question. Therefore, teleological processes are logically prior, at least epistemologically. Okay, suppose that it's possible to have a strong version of some naturalistic reductionism regarding the common criteria for personhood. For example, take two common criteria that many philosophers who argue about personhood take to be central for being a person: possession of rationality and self-consciousness. Right? A lot of this traces back to ideas in the early 1970s. Ideas like Marianne Warren and even Judith Jarvis Thompson in some ways. But Warren's criteria, functionalist criteria, would be a good place to start if you want to read on this, the history of this. Okay, but take these two criteria, possession of rationality and self-consciousness, as criteria for personhood. Suppose that these two criteria can be functionally reduced to biological processes, even in a strong materialistic sense that they are identical to brain state. If this were possible, then we would only know what is required biologically for these criteria to manifest from a study of the specific biology of cases where these traits are manifest. This also shows that epistemically logical priority. This also shows the epistemically logical priority of teleology. How do we know whether an organism will manifest these common criteria? We know from examining paradigmatic cases where they do occur, and we trace back in time the necessary antecedent biological processes that are required for these criteria to be manifest. Now, this raises the question of the logical priority of the existential or ontological teleology of any paradigmatic criterion for personhood. The actualization of any physicalistic criteria for personhood is either teleologically, ontologically prior to the manifestation of those criteria, or it isn't. If it isn't teleologically, ontologically prior, so if it's not teleologically, ontologically prior, then the criteria can never be reached. Or one must arbitrarily select reasons for thinking that those criteria are present. Even worse, one can simply, again, arbitrarily construct the criteria for personhood. It does not seem reasonable to believe that teleological processes are ontologically absent from the biological processes by means of which any criteria of personhood are physically manifest. They can be identified easily, especially if these criteria are ultimately reducible to or co-manifest with physical properties. If, however, they are not ontologically absent, and if the idea of personhood is to remain a real ontological category, as opposed to an arbitrarily constructed one, then it seems reasonable to grant that the criteria for personhood, whatever they may be, are ontologically, logically prior to their actual manifestation. If this is right, then we can make with Aristotle a distinction between two logical modes of having a property. In this case, the properties are possessing rationality and self-consciousness. Just take those as example. Both of which are logically entailed by the reality of a natural teleology in human biological development. The distinction can be generalized from a consideration of a few claims by Aristotle. Consider the following. This is from Aristotle's Metaphysics. It is possible a thing may be capable of being and not be, and capable of not being and yet be. It may be capable of walking, in our case, rationality and self-consciousness, being rational and having self-consciousness, and yet not walk. A thing is capable of doing something if there's nothing impossible in it having the actuality of that which it is said to have the capacity. I love that passage. All right, so from this passage, we can distinguish between two ways in which a biological organism can have a property, whether mental properties, for example, self-consciousness, or physical properties, for example, having a nervous system. The first way an organism can actually have a property is in a mode of actuality. Second is in a mode of potentiality. For example, the property of being self-conscious of my typing this sentence or speaking it right now. The property of being self-conscious of me typing or speaking the sentence is now had by me in a mode of actuality, while the property of my being self-conscious of my typing the next sentence is had by me in a mode of potentiality. It will be true of me, just as long as nothing interferes with the requisite conditions for this property to be actualized. The second way an organism can actually have a property is in the mode of potentiality. It is important to distinguish between at least two types of potentiality. There's the potentiality of one thing to cease being what it is and become another kind of thing. Let's call that substantial change. And there's the potentiality of a thing to actualize something that is present within it such that it remains what it is. Call that accidental change. Teleological processes involve only the latter for a biological organism. For a biological organism to undergo the former, it would cease to exemplify the kind of teleology that is typical of it and begin to exemplify a new teleological order. Thus, gametes, which are ontologically internally related to the organisms which have them, cease to be what they are, that is, they substantially change, in becoming a new organism which exemplifies a new, although similar in kind, determinate set of teleological processes that involve accidental changes for the organism, the new organism. In this mode, it is actually true of me, when I was a very early stage on it, that I am the kind of being who has consciousness, even though I'm not presently conscious. The ontological distinction of modes of having a property is ontologically dependent on the existence of teleology in nature, which I've argued is an irreducible ontological reality. Necessarily, a being which has a property in the mode of actuality had that property ontologically prior to it in a mode of potentiality. These are two inseparable. These two are inseparable. The existence of natural biological teleology in human organisms implies the reality of the distinction. Thus, necessarily, any property that is specified as the determinate mark of personhood will be had in the mode of potentiality, logically prior to the mode of actuality. This is guaranteed by an uninterrupted natural biological teleology. Thus, any property specified as a criterion for personhood is actually had by the human organism at all stages of its teleological development. This would indicate a strong reason to think that personhood is continually had by all organisms capable of teleological development that ends, naturally, without interruption, in the exhibition of any criteria for personhood. No, I'm not a big fan of criterion-based approaches to personhood. I think they're mistaken as an approach to personhood. But if you do pick one, if you want to go that route, well, you have to admit, if my arguments work here, that all persons have those criteria from the moment they come into existence at conception for human beings. So in a rather arcane fashion, whole persons are sometimes referred to as souls. For example, a recent headline read, "Fisherman's Wharf Chapel remembers souls lost at sea." Those lost at sea weren't ethereal ghosts, they were persons. So persons and souls roughly mean the same thing. So the reality of teleology implies soul, a whole person. We thus might borrow a phrase from Eleanor Stump and say something like, teleology indicates a soul as a, quote, configured configurer, end quote. The soul is configured naturally as a real teleological entity and configures the development and expression of all the essential properties had by the whole human person. From the existence of the reality of a human person, it is an objective truth that persons are worthy of moral treatment. Now, if this is so, then it follows that since teleology is real in human organisms, the reality of human persons worthy of moral treatment is necessarily implied. Thus, teleology implies ethics, or ethical treatment, even before the brain or mind itself is manifested teleologically. Teleology, personhood, and meriting ethical treatment are ontologically coextensive properties of all human beings, regardless of their level of development. We move on to the next section here. This is the last section of the paper. It's called Human Teleology and the Ethics of Embryo Destruction. Are human persons at the embryonic stages of teleological development worthy of the same moral treatment as human organisms at the later stages of teleological development in cases of stem cell research done in which embryos are destroyed without ever being implanted? There are at least two possible reasons why human beings at temporally earlier stages of teleological development might be worthy of less moral treatment than those of later stages, but both of these two possible reasons, I believe, are unsatisfactory. 1. There could be a real conflict between the survivability of an earlier stage human person and a latter stage human person. It seems to be a limit case of Judith Thompson's views on an argument for abortion based on bodily rights. It's a famous argument from 1971. Some of us were even alive back then. Pre-Roe Americans. We survived. This type of case is one in which one human person, a pregnant woman, at a latter stage of teleological development can exercise her will to survive over and above the teleological intentions of her offspring. This type of case seems reasonable to many on both sides of the abortion debate, if it is the case in which the death of the mother is nearly guaranteed in the attempt to bring her child to term. The cause of death of the mother in this case is the continued teleological development of the child. If the teleological development of the early stage human person continues, it will stop the teleological development of the later stage human person. Okay, now this is a case in which there's the death of the mother. So I'm presupposing that the attainment of teleological ends in human persons is a good thing. This assumption is that such criterion as consciousness and rationality are good things to have, and that the teleological means to have them are good too. Unfortunately, this case does not bear on the issue of stem cell research, or even IVF at early stages, right? Since no one's life is threatened by the mere existence of the teleological biological development of early stage frozen embryos. Okay, so, bodily rights arguments of the Thompson-esque violinist type, or their more extreme scenarios, they just don't play into stem cell research or IVF. Embryo destruction that's required for pre-implantation of human persons that are at the early stages of their teleological development. Okay, 2. There's another possible objection. Proponents of stem cell research or other embryonic research resulting in the death of an embryo, IVF would, I think, generally play there, especially the development of IVF, but also, not implanting embryos that are created. This isn't an argument for or against IVF here, although I think there's good reason to reject it in general, but no. All right, let me go back to the objection. Proponents of stem cell research or other embryonic research resulting in the death of an embryo could argue that there is a putatively greater good that comes about from the destruction of a human person at an earlier stage of teleological development. What might such a good be? Any discussion of this will simply be a matter of the qualitative and quantitative goods that are specified. This will have to be weighed against the putative goods of the attainment of the teleological ends of personhood. Stem cell research, which is done through the destruction of frozen embryos, is exactly this type of greater good consideration. However, I believe that given the reality of teleology and human personhood, any attempt to do so is absurd. That is, any attempt to justify the destruction of an early stage embryo intentionally for any reason ends up in an absurdity. So one can paint extreme cases and thought experiments where one might save 4 billion teleologically advanced persons from excruciatingly painful suffering and death through 1 or 2 teleologically less advanced human persons who actually feel no pain. The idea that there's a greater good to save billions of people by destroying a few people whether early stage embryos in vitro, adults in permanent vegetative states, etc. Just make up some case, right? This situation, no matter the numbers involved, is reducible to the conflict between two teleological beings at different stages of personhood. Those suffering from conditions which inhibit the normal functioning of their teleological systems are aided by processes which inhibit the normal functioning of teleological systems of other, less teleological developed human beings. In other words, the very criteria often cited for personhood is used to make impossible the criteria of personhood in some beings in order to make possible the criteria in other human beings. This seems to nullify the goods involved, unless one simply quantifies the goodness of the number of rational beings as the sole good involved in moral conflicts between human persons. So you go full utilitarian. It's just a numbers game. You can always go that way. But what if you're part of the calculus that contributes the bigger number? The absurdity of this consideration of bringing about goods with respect to the intentional destruction of teleological entities can be seen by considering that if the teleological end of human biological organisms is the actualization and use of self-consciousness and rationality, and if this very actualization and use of self-consciousness and rationality, which is taken to be a good, which intentionally stops the actualization and use of self-consciousness and rationality, which is taken to be a good, then it follows that the use of the good, in this case, is self-undermining. The use of a good which makes impossible the use of that very same good cannot be a good. This is reminiscent of Plato's claim in the Republic. Isn't all philosophy a footnote to Plato? In the Republic, Plato says that a man skilled in horsemanship cannot make someone unskilled in horsemanship by the exercise of horsemanship. I think he does an example with music as well. Someone skilled in music cannot make someone unmusical or unskilled in music by the exercise of music. Thus, the exercise of reason cannot make someone unskilled in reason by the exercise of reason. If there's an activity that makes someone unreasonable, then that activity itself is unreasonable. This, of course, presupposes that there are real teleological ends of these activities, whether artificial in the case of horsemanship or natural in the case of human reason. I've argued that there are real teleological ends in human biological organisms, and thus it is unreasonable to use reason to undermine the proper rational ends of human biological organisms. Thus it is unreasonable to believe that the intentional destruction of an innocent human person at any stage of teleological development is morally justified. Stem cell research involving harvesting of stem cells, which results in the destruction of frozen embryos, or I would say in cases of IVF, where you have to create more embryos than are implanted, or any experimentation that involves destruction of human persons at the embryonic stage of their existence. Even if it promises much for the curing of debilitating diseases and conditions in order to alleviate human suffering, if teleological realities in human beings imply a way that human beings ought to be, and if one of the ways that human beings ought to be is to be self-conscious and rational, then we ought to seek ways in which we can bring about the maximization of these real teleological ends, which are also goods. This is especially the case with being and good are identical. However, specific techniques which in turn undermine the teleological realities of other human organisms seem to stultify the process. It turns out to be like the man who believes that since buying a new hybrid car will reduce his gasoline consumption by half, then buying two such cars will allow him to drive around with no gas at all. You might look at C.S. Lewis's story of the Irishman's wood stove in The Abolition of Man. The idea of teleological beings at advanced stages eliminating the teleological outcomes of other teleological beings in order to advance teleological development in themselves seems to undermine the very telos of being human, therefore ought to be avoided if achieving human ends are goods in themselves. Thanks for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom. You.